Well, I hope you'll speak up about what's been happening over there. Some of us are trying to address the disruption to neighborhood peace.
What would you do if someone tried to silence the voices that have been lifting up your community for decades, only to discover they were speaking to the very person who could protect those voices? It was Thursday evening in the City Hall Council chambers, the air thick with tension and the lingering scent of old wood polish. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the burgundy carpet, while the low murmur of concerned citizens filled the formal space. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the tall windows, but inside something much more explosive was about to unfold. But one person wasn't sitting with the other community members in the gallery. Dorothy Washington stood near the back of the room, her worn leather purse clutched tightly, her Sunday best dress pressed and modest. At 62, her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her kind eyes surveyed the room with quiet dignity. But what happened next would change everything, and expose a man's true character in the most public way possible. Dorothy Washington wasn't just another face in the crowd. For 15 years, she had served as the volunteer choir director at Mount Olive Baptist Church, pouring her heart into nurturing voices that had grown up in a neighborhood others had written off. Her small apartment 3 blocks from the church was filled with sheet music, thank you cards from former choir members, and photos of young people who had found their confidence through song. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she unlocked the church's fellowship hall at 6 p.m. sharp. She arranged folding chairs in neat semicircles, warmed up the old upright piano, and welcomed anyone who wanted to sing, from 8-year-old Jeremiah who still forgot the words, to 85-year-old Mrs. Patterson who had been harmonizing since before Dorothy was born. They practiced everything from traditional hymns to contemporary gospel, their voices echoing off the worn linoleum floors and wood-paneled walls. Most people saw her as the quiet church lady who smiled and nodded at community meetings. They watched her serve coffee at school board sessions and take notes during budget hearings, assuming she was just another concerned citizen. But Dorothy Washington carried herself with a quiet strength that came from years of fighting battles most people never knew about. Richard Sterling wasn't new to getting his way. 35 years as a commercial real estate developer had carved deep lines around his eyes and built an unshakable confidence in his ability to solve problems with phone calls and strongly worded letters. His corner house on Maple Street was the largest in the neighborhood, a testament to what happened when you knew the right people and weren't afraid to make demands. Richard had moved to the area 8 months ago, drawn by the up-and-coming designation in real estate listings and the promise of property values that were about to turn around. He'd immediately begun documenting what he called quality-of-life issues, noting every barking dog, every teenager's music, every moment when his new neighborhood didn't match his expectations of suburban tranquility. The Mount Olive Baptist Church sat directly across from his manicured lawn, its modest brick facade and simple wooden cross a constant reminder that his vision of the neighborhood wasn't everyone's priority. But Richard Sterling liked to solve problems. His three-piece suits were always pressed, his gray hair perfectly styled, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no by people he considered important. In Richard's mind, he was improving the community. Someone had to maintain standards, and if that someone had to be him, so be it. It was 7:15 p.m. when Dorothy entered the council chambers through the main doors. The weekly city council meeting was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, and she could see Richard Sterling already positioned at the podium, a thick manila folder in his hands and a confident set to his shoulders. Richard had been packing near the front of the room, reviewing his notes and adjusting his navy tie. His mood was focused, almost anticipatory. He had called the mayor's office twice that week to ensure he would be heard during public comment, and now he had documentation, timestamps, and what he considered an airtight case. Their eyes met briefly as Dorothy made her way past the gallery seating. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice carrying across the half-empty room. "Are you here about the church noise issue too?" Dorothy paused, turning toward him with a polite expression. "I'm here for the council meeting, sir." Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well, I hope you'll speak up about what's been happening over there. Some of us are trying to address the disruption to neighborhood peace." "I see," Dorothy replied simply, continuing toward the front of the room. Richard watched her go, nodding her modest appearance and assuming she was another neighbor who had finally had enough of the disturbance. Perfect, he thought. Community support would only strengthen his position. Richard Sterling approached the podium when his name was called during public comment. "Thank you, Madam President. he began, not yet realizing the significance of his words. I'm here to address a serious quality of life issue that's been plaguing Maple Street for months. He opened his folder with practiced efficiency. The Mount Olive Baptist Church has been conducting what they call choir practice twice a week from 6 to 8:30 p.m. The volume is excessive, the music is disruptive, and frankly, some of us didn't buy homes in this neighborhood to be subjected to constant noise. Dorothy remained standing near the side wall, her expression neutral but attentive. Several church members in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, while other residents leaned forward to hear better. I have documentation here, Richard continued, pulling out a thick stack of papers. Decibel readings taken from my property line, timestamps of every disturbance, and testimony from other concerned neighbors. He gestured toward the gallery. This isn't about religion, you understand. This is about respect for community standards and property values. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some supportive, others clearly opposed. Richard's confidence grew with each supportive nod he spotted in the audience. That's when Richard Sterling decided to drive his point home. Look, I've tried to be reasonable about this, he said, his voice rising slightly. But these people seem to think they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, without consideration for the rest of us. Dorothy's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent, watching him carefully. I'm not asking for much, Richard continued, warming to his theme. Just basic consideration. Keep it down, maybe limit it to one night a week, or better yet, find somewhere more appropriate for this kind of activity. The way he said activity made several church members bristle visibly. An elderly man in the third row started to stand, but his wife gently pulled him back down. Mr. Sterling, came a voice from the council table, are you suggesting the church doesn't have a right to use its own fellowship hall? Richard turned toward the voice, then looked back at the gathered crowd. I'm suggesting that rights come with responsibilities, and some of us have been in this community longer than others. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dorothy's hands clasped more tightly around her purse, and she took a small step forward, though still not speaking. Mr. Sterling, another council member interjected, could you be more specific about what you're requesting? Dorothy Washington moved quietly toward the council table, her sensible shoes making soft clicks on the polished floor. She set her purse down in the chair marked with a small placard reading Council President and turned to face Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent chamber, I believe you were addressing your concerns to me. Richard's folder slipped slightly in his hands as he stared at her. The confident expression on his face began to shift, confusion replacing certainty. I'm sorry, he stammered, looking from Dorothy to the council table and back again. I'm Dorothy Washington, President of the City Council, she said calmly, settling into her chair and adjusting the microphone. You've been directing your comments to Madam President for the past 10 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the suddenly significant looks from other council members, the barely contained smiles from the church congregation, and the growing awareness of his situation. You're the council president, he managed. For the past 6 years, Dorothy confirmed, opening her own folder and pulling out the meeting agenda. And I should mention, Mr. Sterling, that I'm also the volunteer choir director at Mount Olive Baptist Church, the same choir whose noise you've been documenting. Richard's face went through several shades of red and white. He looked down at his carefully prepared presentation, then back up at Dorothy, clearly struggling to process this turn of events. The reaction from the gallery was immediate and varied. The church members could no longer contain their pride and amazement, while other residents looked between Richard and Dorothy with newfound understanding. Someone in the back row whispered, "Oh my lord," loud enough for everyone to hear. Dorothy maintained her professional composure, but there was a gentle firmness in her voice as she continued. Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your concerns about community harmony. However, I should point out that Mount Olive Baptist Church has been serving this neighborhood for 43 years. Our Tuesday and Thursday evening choir practices have been a tradition for over 2 decades. Richard attempted to salvage his position. I had no idea you were, I wasn't trying to. Mr. Sterling, Dorothy interrupted gently, what exactly weren't you trying to do? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that his assumptions about the quiet church lady had been spectacularly wrong. Councilman Bradley, sitting to Dorothy's left, cleared his throat. For the record, Mrs. Washington's choir has performed at city events, community celebrations, and holiday programs for years. They've never had noise complaints until now. Richard's prepared presentation suddenly seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly ill-informed. 2 weeks later, the Tuesday and Thursday evening choir practices continued as they had for 20 years, but something had changed in the neighborhood dynamics. Richard Sterling's complaints had been formally dismissed, and word had spread quickly through the community about the man who had unknowingly lectured the city council president about the choir she had directed for 15 years. Dorothy continued her dual role with the same quiet dignity she had always shown. At the following council meeting, she addressed Richard's original concerns with the thoroughness they deserved, not as the choir director he had dismissed, but as the elected official he had failed to recognize. She organized a community forum on noise ordinances, invited all neighbors to attend a choir performance, and established clear guidelines that protected both community peace and cultural expression. Richard Sterling found himself in an uncomfortable position. His neighbors now viewed him as the man who had tried to silence voices that many considered the heart of the community. He attended one choir practice, not to complain, but to understand what he had been fighting against. He left quietly without comment. The Mount Olive Baptist Church choir grew by 12 members in the following month. Dorothy Washington continued to serve her community in both capacities, never drawing attention to the irony of that Thursday evening, but never forgetting the lesson it taught about assumptions and respect. Richard Sterling eventually moved away from Maple Street, citing a desire to find a better fit for his lifestyle. The story of Dorothy Washington and Richard Sterling reminds us that leadership doesn't always come with titles or obvious markers of authority. Sometimes the most powerful people in our communities are the ones who serve quietly, who show up consistently, and who lead by example rather than by demanding recognition. It also teaches us about the danger of assumptions, about judging people by their appearance, their address, or their role in our communities. Richard Sterling saw a church lady, he failed to see a community leader. He heard noise, he failed to hear the sound of neighbors coming together in joy and tradition. But perhaps most importantly, this story shows us the grace that comes from true leadership. Dorothy Washington could have humiliated Richard Sterling, could have used her position to retaliate or embarrass him further. Instead, she used the moment to educate, to bridge differences, and to strengthen her community. The next time you find yourself making assumptions about the quiet person in the room, remember Dorothy Washington. The next time you're tempted to complain about something that doesn't fit your vision of how things should be, remember that someone else might be seeing community, tradition, and home where you see only inconvenience. And remember that sometimes, the person you're complaining to might just be the person with the power to do something about it, in ways you never expected. What assumptions are you making today? What voices in your community deserve to be heard rather than silenced? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us to look deeper, listen better, and lead with compassion.